For 11 years, I ran the Dawn Kitchen at Harrow's Landing, and in 11 years I never once refused a child a bowl because of what was written on their manifest. I want that understood before I tell you the rest, because the rest of it cost me plenty, and I'd rather you knew first that I'd have paid it again. Harrow's Landing sits where 3 shipping lanes meet, and nothing else recommends it. Gray water, grayer sky, a customs house that smells of tar and old paperwork. Every morning before the sun cleared the breakwater, the refugee transports came limping in from the collapsed colonies further out, hulls scored from debris fields, running lights failing, carrying whoever they'd managed to pull out before the evacuation windows closed. Every morning, I set up my table on the dock with a pot big enough to drown in, and ladled out whatever the aid office had managed to scrounge that week. Fish stock, mostly. Barley when we were lucky. The customs clerks worked one line, the health inspectors worked another, and I worked the one nobody had bothered to make official, the line where a person got fed whether or not the paperwork said they were entitled to it. I'd been doing it long enough that the marshals mostly left me alone. I wasn't smuggling anything they cared about. I wasn't hiding weapons or contraband, or grown men with warrants on their heads. I was an aid cook, with a pot, and a bad habit of treating hungry children like they mattered more than the line item they occupied on somebody's ledger, and for 11 years, that had been a small enough sin that nobody thought it worth the trouble of stopping. She came in on the 6th ship that spring, half carried down the gangway by a woman who died 3 steps past the customs line and didn't get up again. Nobody claimed the child. That happens more than you'd think. In this line of work, the manifest says one thing and the doc says another, and somewhere between the two, a small person is left standing, with nobody's hand in theirs. She was pale gray-green, narrow as a reed, with a throat that lit faintly along 2 thin lines when she was frightened. A soft, cool glow, gone again the moment she calmed. Fisherfolk stock, from one of the drowned colonies, the kind that used to read the tide by the color of their own skin. She carried nothing but a carved shell whistle on a cord, and she wouldn't let go of it even when the customs clerk tried to note it down as cargo. I gave her the whistle back myself and told the clerk to write it as personal effects, and that was the whole of our first conversation. She didn't speak. I didn't push her to. I set a bowl in front of her, and she ate like someone who'd learned not to trust that a second bowl was coming. And when she finished, she looked up at me the way you look at weather. Not trusting. Not yet. Just watching to see which way I'd break. I called her Ilo because she wouldn't tell me her name, and because it was close enough to a word in her own tongue for small that she answered to it without flinching. She started sleeping under my table. I let her. The aid office has rules about that, same as it has rules about everything, and I have never in 11 years let those rules cost a child their only warm corner. For a month she was simply there, a small watchful shadow at the edge of the kitchen, learning the rhythm of the docks the way any wild thing learns a new territory, by counting the hours between dangers. She learned which crates to hide behind when the marshals did their morning count. She learned that the second ladle in the pot was always thicker than the first, and took to timing her bowl for it without ever once asking. She never smiled, not in that whole month, but she stopped flinching when I set a hand near her shoulder, and by the 3rd week she'd taken to sitting close enough that our arms nearly touched while I worked the stove, close enough that I could hear her humming, low and toneless, 3 notes over and over that I never asked her to explain. I think it was her mother's. I never asked that either. The fever came in on the 9th ship, 4 weeks later, and by the time anyone admitted what it was, half the arrivals on Pier 3 were carrying it. They called it the hollowing. It took its time, hollowed a person out slow, fever and thirst, and a stillness in the eyes that didn't come back once it settled in. The marshals didn't wait for proof. They never do. Word came down that any child showing symptoms went straight to the quarantine hulk anchored past the breakwater, and everyone on the docks knew what that meant, because nobody who went out to that hulk sick came back well, and precious few came back at all. Elo's throat lines stopped glowing on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, she couldn't hold the whistle steady in her hand. I didn't report it. I want that said plainly too. I looked a marshal in the eye that week and told him my kitchen was clean, and I have never been an easy liar, but I was one that day, and I'd be one again. I moved her into the storeroom behind the kitchen, packed her in every blanket I owned, and spooned broth into her past, the point where she could swallow it on her own. The customs house ran their sweeps twice a day. I learned the sound of their boots on the boards, and the exact number of seconds I had to get her out of sight. There is nothing dignified in what I did. I hid a sick child in a root cellar and lied to armed men about it, over and over, for 6 days. And I'd tell you it was easy, except that it wasn't. It was the hardest 6 days of an unremarkable life, and I don't regret 1 hour of it. On the 4th night her fever broke past its peak and didn't climb again, and I understood, the way you understand weather, that she was going to live. I sat with my back against the cellar wall and cried the way you cry when you've been too frightened for too long to do it properly at the time, and she watched me do it with her strange pale eyes and put her small hand flat against my arm, which was the first time she had ever touched me on purpose. By the 7th day she could sit up and hold the whistle again, and by the 9th I found, buried 3 folders deep in the manifest office's dead files, a cousin branch registry from her drowned colony, a fisherfolk enclave resettled 2 systems over, that had survived the collapse whole. I forged nothing. I didn't have to. I only had to look, which is more than the customs house had bothered to do in 5 weeks of writing her down as unclaimed cargo. I bought her a berth on the next lawful transport with money I didn't have, and wrote a letter of provenance the aid office had no grounds to refuse, and on the 11th day, I walked her down the same gangway her mother had died on and put her into the hands of a fisherfolk elder who wept to see the whistle around her neck and knew, from that alone, exactly whose child she was. I want to tell you the fever never touched me. It would be a cleaner story that way, and cleaner is usually what gets remembered, but I sat with her for 6 nights breathing the same close air, and 3 days after her ship cleared the breakwater, my own throat began to ache in a way I recognized, and by the time I'm telling you this, the marshals have already been to see me twice, and I have already lied to them twice, because there is nothing left in that root cellar to protect, and I see no reason to spend my last honest lies on men who never once came looking for a child, only for a violation to write up. I don't say this for pity. I've had a good run at a hard trade, and I fed more children than I ever turned away. And if the ledger closes on me now, it closes with more in the credit column than most people manage. I think of her sometimes, out past the breakwater on clean water, learning to read the tide again, the way her people did before the collapse. And I think the whistle will hang around her neck for the rest of a long life. And some mornings, that's worth more to me than the fever is a cost. The Dawn kitchen is still running. I trained the boy who helps me well enough that the table won't sit empty the morning I don't come down to it, and I told him what I'm telling you now, which is the only rule that ever mattered here. You do not turn a child away for what's written on a piece of paper, whatever it costs you to ignore it. 11 years I never broke that rule. I'm not about to start now. On the one morning it might actually be cheap to.